when you look at it in the context of women, and the penal system, but let's just take when we've looked at other women criminals. I've looked at Martha Stewart's one I mentioned. Any context? Is there any differences? Does gender really play a role, you see, in how maybe not necessarily people are sentenced, but the reaction and the attention we give cases like this?
So there's a smaller sample size among white-collar criminals. The Wall Street Journal took an interesting analysis here and looked at 16 female offenders compared to 143 male offenders. So we're averaging very different numbers. But this analysis showed that women who are sentenced for white-collar crimes receive about half the sentence that men receive. Now, looking at a ranking of some of the most prominent white-collar fraud cases, Bernie Madoff is at the top with 150 years. Elizabeth Holmes kind of falls in the sweet spot there. I mean, on this list, and that includes the president of Enron and other prominent fraud cases, WorldCon. You do have Martha Stewart. She's at the very bottom. So she does not rank in the middle.
Well, it's insider trading too.
But, 11 years is kind of in that sweet spot. I'm seeing 10 years, 12 years, 12 years, 7 months, 14 years.
What do you think the judge was trying to do here?
I think the judge was trying to make a statement to other founders, other startup founders, that you can't just invent data. You can't just have a product that doesn't work, but continue to bill it as if it does work. This is, I think, putting a stake in the ground.
So one other question, Maggie, which is I think that because there are so few women in these realms, they do become both symbols and sort of these, very polarizing. And what impact has this had, the case in general, in terms of other women in Silicon Valley? And have you detected any reaction? Because it's hard enough to get money, when you're going in to get VC funding, to get support. Has there been a ripple effect of Elizabeth Holmes in terms of what other, prominent female entrepreneurs are saying with regard to the reaction they get?
I have two answers there. One is we started to pull the data last year around the occasion of the trial to see if there was a chilling effect. And unfortunately, women get such a small percentage of the pie of venture funding that it's just small numbers on top of small numbers. And it's hard to establish causation. I've heard from some founders in the tech space, right? Because if you're running a retail company, if you are like a Birdies or a Rent the Runway, for instance, it's a fundamentally different business than a blood testing company. So I also think you're not going to see the effect across founders in all sectors. You kind of have to zero in on healthcare specifically. And I've heard from some founders about increased due diligence from investors, extra questions, a little bit of a hesitation, but it wasn't bearing out in the numbers that we pulled last year. But again, it's hard to establish causation and correlation when you're already dealing with systemic macroeconomic issues, systemic gender inequality issues. So I don't want to say anything definitive.
And the hype cycle, right? I mean, part of what you do in Silicon Valley and elsewhere is you're supposed to be pumping up the potential, but obviously not to the point of, what's essentially systemic fraud and advertising a technology that does not exist and frankly selling it. So that's what I think is fascinating, is the degree to which nobody really checked. Nobody.
But that also, the hype cycle gets to the other point that I hear from female founders. I wrote a story earlier this year about the end of the girl boss era, right? We've seen a number of prominent female CEOs step down from the company that they founded. And these were some women who had been tagged as girl boss. Now, a lot of these founders worked in the consumer space. So they are selling a product often to a predominantly female customer base. So by making themselves the face of the company, or in doing the promotion cycle to get the investment dollars that they need, they become the face of the company, right? I heard from some founders saying they didn't want to become the face of the company, but to sell makeup, to sell clothes, it's kind of what you had to do. You establish you have a platform. The bigger the platform you have, the more investors will trust you. And it just is a vicious cycle, or in some cases, a virtuous cycle, right? Where you get the money. But I think in this case, Elizabeth Holmes became the face of her company, and became one of the rarefied female founders in the media space, who then she committed fraud. And then other people might say, hey, the media is picking on female founders. But I don't think that in reporting fraud, we are picking on a female founder so much as reporting the fraud.
Yeah.
It just so happens that she is part of a very small percentage of female founders who get money.
You grab our attention on the way up, we're going to continue paying attention on the way down, right?
That's a much more succinct way of saying what I just said.
Not at all. Thanks very much, Maggie.